Hello, in this video I will explain what a pressure volume loop is. A pressure volume loop is a graph that represents the changes in volume and pressure in the left ventricle over one cardiac cycle. At point A, the left ventricle is relaxed and has the minimum amount of blood and pressure. Oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins starts to fill the atrium. This represents early ventricular diastole, as no blood is entering the ventricle, pressure and volume does not change. Once the pressure of the atrium exceeds the pressure of the ventricle, the mitral valve will open and the atrial blood will passively flow into the ventricle. We can see this on the graph as volume is increasing. Although the ventricle is expanding to accommodate the entering blood, the pressure doesn't go up by much. This represents later ventricular diastole. Atrial systole or atrial contraction is the last portion of the ventricle filling, which is represented on the graph from point A to point B. We can see that pressure increases slightly as the ventricle is expanding from containing the maximum volume of blood the ventricle will hold. This is also known as end diastolic volume. Ventricular contraction closes the mitral valve. From point B to C, isovolumic contraction can be observed, where the ventricles are contracting but the volume of the ventricles do not change. As both the mitral valve and aortic valve is closed, pressure dramatically increases. Once ventricular pressure exceeds aortic pressure, the aortic valve will open, which can be seen on the graph at point C. From point C to D, we can see that the pressure continues to increase as the ventricle continues to contract and that the volume is decreasing as blood is being pushed into the aorta. This represents ventricular systole. Point D on the graph represents end systolic volume, the minimum amount of blood the ventricle contains during one cycle. As point D represents ESV and point B represents EDV, we are able to calculate stroke volume from the graph. Stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped per contraction and is calculated from subtracting ESV from EDV, the volume of blood in the ventricle before contraction minus the volume of blood after contraction. Point D to A represents isovolumic relaxation, where the ventricle is relaxing but the volume in the ventricle does not change. This occurs when the aortic valve closes. The valve closes from the blood in the aorta wanting to go down the pressure gradient and back into the ventricle as the ventricular pressure falls below aortic pressure. To recap, point A is where the mitral valve opens, point B is where the mitral valve closes, point C is where the aortic valve opens, and point D is where the aortic valve closes. From point A to B, pressure increases slightly and volume changes from 65 milliliters to 135 milliliters. From point B to C, pressure increases to 80 millimeters of mercury and volume stays the same. From point C to D, volume decreases from 135 milliliters to 65 milliliters, where pressure increases and hits a peak of 120 millimeters of mercury and then starts to decrease slightly. From point D to A, volume stays the same at 65 milliliters and pressure decreases rapidly to approximately 10 millimeters of mercury. This cycle will start again when atrial pressure exceeds the pressure in the ventricle. Thank you so much for watching.